They heard her before they really saw her, the way a voice sometimes reaches a place before the person does, thin and shaking, carried by the wind as if it didn't belong to anyone anymore. By the time heads began to turn, she was already in the center of the street, standing where no one willingly stood unless they had nowhere left to go. Her name was Lila Mercer, though most people in town had only ever heard it in passing, attached to small errands, quiet exchanges, a life that never made trouble. But today, trouble had found her anyway, and it had dragged her into the open for everyone to witness. Her hands trembled at her sides, fingers clutching the edge of her worn dress, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Please," she said again, her voice breaking in a way that made it hard to listen to, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. It was the kind of sound people avoided, the kind that made them look away instead of closer. A man stood a few steps in front of her, broad-shouldered, unmoved, his expression carved out of something harder than anger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in his silence was enough to keep her exactly where she was. Around them, the town gathered slowly, forming a loose circle that tightened without anyone noticing they were moving. Faces appeared in doorways, along the edges of the saloon, near the general store, all watching with that same distant hesitation. Some whispered. Some shook their heads. But no one stepped forward. Lila's eyes moved from one face to another, searching, pleading without words now, hoping to find even a flicker of recognition, of humanity, of something that would break the stillness pressing down on her chest. "I didn't do it," she tried again, quieter this time, like even she wasn't sure it mattered anymore. The man in front of her exhaled slowly, almost bored, and took a step closer, enough to make her flinch. That movement rippled through the crowd, but still, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, deliberate, built from 100 small decisions not to act, and it settled over her like something final. The sun had begun to dip just enough to cast longer shadows across the street, stretching everything thin and distorted, as if the town itself was trying to pull away from what it was becoming. Lila swayed slightly where she stood, her strength slipping in quiet pieces, her breath uneven. The man reached out, not roughly, but with a certainty that felt worse, his hand brushing her arm as if he had already decided what would happen next. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not loud enough to be called protest, not strong enough to be called anything at all. Just noise. Just proof that people were there, watching, witnessing, allowing. Lila's knees weakened, and she dropped slightly, catching herself just before she fell, her hands hitting the dirt with a soft, hollow sound. Dust rose around her fingers, clinging to her skin, marking her in a way words never could. She looked up again, desperation no longer hidden, no longer restrained. "Please," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, not to the man in front of her, but to the space between all of them, the place where someone, anyone, could have stepped in. But no one did. The sheriff stood back near the saloon, arms crossed, gaze fixed somewhere just beyond her, as if refusing to meet her eyes made him less responsible. A woman near the store doorway turned her face away. A man near the hitching post shifted his weight but stayed where he was. Each person found a reason, a moment, a small excuse not to act. And those excuses stacked up, one on top of another, until they became something solid enough to trap her inside. The man in front of her straightened slightly, preparing to finish what he had started, whatever that meant, whatever line he believed he had the right to cross. And just as the moment tightened, just as it seemed to settle into something irreversible, a sound broke through it. Not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable. The soft, deliberate tap of boots against wood, slow and steady, approaching from the far end of the street. It didn't demand attention, but it took it anyway. One by one, heads turned again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of something closer to unease. He didn't rush, and that was the first thing people noticed. There was no urgency in his steps, no visible anger, no weapon drawn or threat spoken. Just a man walking forward with a kind of quiet certainty that didn't ask for permission. Dust clung to the edges of his coat, his hat casting a shadow low over his face, hiding more than it revealed. He moved through the space the crowd had left without realizing it, their circle widening slightly as he passed, not because they chose to move, but because something in his presence made standing in his way feel wrong. Lila's eyes lifted again, slower this time, heavier. But when she saw him, something shifted, small, fragile, but real. He stopped a few steps away from her, not looking at the man who had taken control of the moment, not looking at the sheriff, not looking at anyone else, just her. For a second, nothing happened. The wind moved lightly through the street, carrying dust and the faint creak of wood from somewhere unseen. Then, with a motion so simple it almost went unnoticed, he lifted his hand to the brim of his hat. Fingers brushed the edge, paused, and then he removed it, holding it at his side. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't loud or forceful. But it changed something. The man in front of Lila hesitated, just slightly, just enough for the shift to begin. Because the gesture wasn't for the crowd, it wasn't for authority, it was for her, respect, quiet and deliberate, placed in a space where none had been given, and that respect carried weight, the kind that made everything else suddenly feel smaller, weaker, less certain. The stranger finally lifted his gaze, eyes calm, steady, unhurried, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but impossible to ignore. That's enough. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a challenge, it was a boundary, and for the first time since it had all begun, the moment paused, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. The man who had been standing over Lila straightened fully now, his confidence no longer as solid as it had been seconds before. "This ain't your concern," he said. But the words didn't land the same way anymore. They lacked something, certainty maybe, or the quiet agreement of the crowd that had backed him without speaking. The stranger didn't move closer.